The morning of June 4th, 1942, 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Norman Dusty Kleiss gripped the control stick of his Douglas SBD Dauntless, the aircraft trembling as he pushed the nose forward into a 70-degree dive. Below him, the Japanese carrier Kaga maneuvered desperately, her deck crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the fleet. Tracers arced upward like deadly fireworks. Kleiss had approximately 40 seconds to live or die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 2,000 feet, Kleiss pulled the bomb release lever. The 500-pound bomb dropped away. Then he did something that violated every instinct a pilot possessed. Instead of pulling back on the stick to escape, he rolled the aircraft inverted, dove deeper toward the enemy fleet, then snapped upright and began a violent series of random turns. Hard left, hard right, climb, dive, roll. The Japanese gun crews, trained to track aircraft pulling up and away after bombing runs, found themselves aiming at empty air. Kleiss's rear gunner, radioman John Snowden, watched as anti-aircraft shells detonated where they should have been, where any sane pilot would have been, but weren't. The carrier erupted in flames behind them. They escaped at wave-top height, jinking wildly, while every gun in the Japanese fleet fired at the space they had already vacated. What happened that morning above the Kido Butai would redefine dive-bombing tactics for the remainder of the war. But the story of how American pilots learned to confuse enemy gunners through radical post-attack maneuvers begins not at Midway, but in the classified training documents written months earlier by men who understood a simple truth. Predictability kills. Chaos saves. January 1942, Naval Air Station, North Island, California. The United States had been at war for exactly 37 days. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated with terrifying clarity the vulnerability of American naval forces. Across the Pacific, Imperial Japanese Navy carrier strike forces roamed at will, sinking Allied warships, conquering islands, destroying air bases. The Douglas SBD Dauntless represented America's primary offensive weapon against this onslaught. Nicknamed slow but deadly by pilots who understood both its limitations and its lethal potential, the Dauntless was not impressive by any performance metric. Maximum speed, 255 miles per hour, slower than most fighters by nearly 100 miles per hour. Range, modest. Defensive armament, 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns and 1 or 2 30-caliber guns operated by the rear-seat radioman gunner. What the Dauntless possessed was precision. The aircraft could deliver a bomb within feet of a target through a technique that required pilots to aim their entire aircraft at the enemy, dive at angles approaching vertical, and release ordnance at suicidally low altitudes. The mathematics of dive bombing were brutal and unforgiving. A pilot approaching a target at 15,000 feet would push the nose over until the aircraft reached a 70 to 75-degree dive angle. The Dauntless would accelerate rapidly, airspeed building toward 240 knots. Perforated dive brakes deployed from the wings created drag, preventing the aircraft from exceeding safe speeds and giving the pilot more time to aim. For 30 to 40 seconds, the pilot descended directly toward the target, while anti-aircraft gunners below calculated lead angles, trained their weapons, and fired. During this period, the Dauntless followed a predictable ballistic path. Gun crews could accurately estimate where the aircraft would be at any given moment. At approximately 2,000 feet altitude, the pilot released the bomb. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Every tactical manual, every training document, every instructor emphasized the same survival procedure. Pull back hard on the control stick, raise the dive brakes, advance throttle to full military power, climb away at maximum rate. The procedure made perfect sense. It got pilots away from the target as quickly as possible. It minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. It followed the laws of physics and common sense. It also created a perfectly predictable flight path that enemy gunners could anticipate and exploit. Japanese anti-aircraft crews trained extensively on exactly this scenario. American dive bombers attacked at steep angles. They released bombs at approximately 2,000 feet. They then pulled up sharply and climbed away. Gun crews positioned weapons to intersect this known flight path. When the American pilot pulled up, his aircraft flew directly into a barrage of fire, positioned precisely where the gunners knew he would be. The kill rate was devastating. In early 1942 engagements, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed American dive bombers at unsustainable rates. During the Battle of Coral Sea, in May 1942, dive bomber squadrons suffered significant casualties. The problem was not the dive itself. The dive was too fast, too steep, too brief for effective tracking. The problem was the escape. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, Commander John S. Thatch was developing a radical new defensive maneuver for fighters that would later bear his name. The Thatch weave allowed two fighters to protect each other through coordinated weaving patterns that confused enemy pilots and created shooting opportunities. The principle was simple. Unpredictability disrupted enemy tactics. Several dive bomber instructors began discussing whether similar principles could apply to post-attack escapes. The challenge was different. A dive bomber at 500 feet altitude, having just pulled out of a high-G maneuver, flying at maximum speed over an enemy fleet, had limited energy, limited altitude, and limited time. Elaborate aerobatic maneuvers were impossible, but random, violent changes in direction might create enough unpredictability to disrupt gun-laying solutions. The tactic received an unofficial name among pilots: jinking. The term had no formal military definition. It described a series of rapid, random maneuvers intended to prevent enemy gunners from establishing an accurate track. Hard turn left for 3 seconds, roll right and pull. Push the nose down, pull back up. No pattern, no predictability. Just violent, controlled chaos that forced gun crews to constantly adjust their aim. Training doctrine did not formally incorporate jinking into dive bombing procedures. The official manual still emphasized climbing away at maximum rate, but informally, experienced pilots began teaching newer aviators the technique. During training flights over the California coast, instructors would have students practice random maneuvering at low altitude after simulated bomb runs. The physical demands were considerable. A pilot pulling 4 Gs during the dive recovery already experienced significant physiological stress. Blood pooled in the lower body, vision grayed at the edges. Some pilots experienced momentary blackouts. Immediately after recovery, while still experiencing G-load effects, the pilot had to initiate random, violent maneuvers that generated additional G-forces. Norman Kleiss learned dive bombing at Pensacola in 1940. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938, served 2 years aboard surface ships, then entered flight training. His instructors noted good situational awareness, steady hands, and an analytical approach to flying. He joined Scouting Squadron 6 aboard USS Enterprise in May 1940. For 2 years, Kleiss practiced his craft: navigation flights over the Pacific, gunnery runs against towed targets, dive bombing practice against target sleds towed by destroyers. The repetition built muscle memory. Push over into the dive. Center the target in the telescopic sight. Account for wind drift. Release at the proper altitude. Pull out, climb away. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor found Enterprise at sea, having just delivered Marine aircraft to Wake Island. Scouting 6 flew combat air patrol around the carrier task force. Kleiss flew several missions that day but encountered no enemy aircraft. On December 8, while flying a patrol mission, several American destroyers mistook his Dauntless for a Japanese dive bomber and opened fire. The experience taught him about friendly fire. It also taught him about the difficulties anti-aircraft gunners faced tracking fast-moving targets. February 1, 1942. Enterprise launched an airstrike against Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Kleiss dropped his wing-mounted bombs on a parked aircraft at Roy Airfield. Later, he placed his 500-pound bomb on the light cruiser Katori. The ship sustained damage but remained afloat. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but poorly coordinated. Japanese gunners had little experience engaging American dive bombers. That would change. Through February, March, and April 1942, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed repeatedly across the Pacific. Each engagement provided lessons. Japanese anti-aircraft crews improved their techniques. They learned to anticipate American dive bombing tactics. They positioned guns to create kill zones in the areas where American pilots typically pulled up after attack runs. American casualties mounted May 7 through 8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never sighted each other. All attacks came from carrier aircraft. Yorktown and Lexington launched multiple strikes against Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho. Dauntless squadrons scored hits, but losses were significant. The Japanese were learning. Their gun crews tracked American dive bombers with increasing accuracy. During the pull-out phase, when American pilots followed standard procedures, pull back, raise dive brakes, climb away, they flew into concentrated fire. Several Dauntlesses were shot down during their escape rather than during their attack dive. Pilots who survived returned to their carriers with aircraft riddled by shrapnel. Debriefs revealed a pattern. The most dangerous phase was not the dive. The most dangerous phase was the escape. Japanese gunners anticipated the American pullout and positioned fire accordingly. Some pilots had instinctively begun jinking during their escapes. Hard turns immediately after pullout, random altitude changes, unpredictable flight paths. These pilots reported less accurate enemy fire. Gun crews appeared confused when targets didn't behave predictably. After Coral Sea, informal discussions spread through the Dauntless community. Veterans shared techniques. The most successful pilots described their escape maneuvers. Turn hard immediately after pullout. Don't climb straight away. Change direction every few seconds. Make the gunners guess where you'll be. June 4th, 1942 approached. American codebreakers had decrypted Japanese naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese planned to attack Midway Atoll. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway in ambush positions. The Japanese Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, approached from the northwest. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Combined, they embarked over 200 aircraft operated by the most experienced carrier aviators in the world. The morning of June 4th, Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 prepared for launch from Enterprise. 32. Douglas SBD Dauntlesses spotted on the flight deck. Pilots attended final briefings. Likely target, Japanese carriers reported by patrol aircraft. Expected opposition, intense. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey would lead the strike as Air Group Commander. The mission plan was simple. Find the Japanese carriers. Attack from high altitude. Destroy them before they could launch strikes against the American fleet. At 07:06, Enterprise began launching her air group. McCluskey led 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 34 Dauntlesses, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters into the sky. The formation climbed to altitude and set course toward the reported Japanese position. They found nothing. For over 2 hours, McCluskey's squadron searched fruitlessly. Fuel gauges dropped toward critical levels. Some pilots calculated they no longer had enough fuel to return to Enterprise. The decision to continue searching meant possible death by fuel exhaustion. Then McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer, Arashi, steaming at full speed. The destroyer had just finished an unsuccessful depth charge attack on the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey made an instant decision. Follow the destroyer's heading. It would lead back to the fleet. At approximately 10:20 Midway time, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers converged on the Kido Butai from different directions almost simultaneously. 37 Dauntlesses from Enterprise, 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown. The timing was not coordinated. It was extraordinarily fortunate. Minutes earlier, 3 American torpedo bomber squadrons had attacked the Japanese carriers at low altitude. All 3 squadrons were annihilated. 41 TBD Devastators attacked. 36 were shot down. Only 5 pilots survived. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters, dove to sea level to intercept the slow, obsolete torpedo bombers. This left the high-altitude approaches undefended. When the Dauntlesses arrived at 15,000 feet, Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible condition. Their decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, preparing to launch strikes against the American fleet. Fuel lines were open. Ordnance was exposed. Combat Air Patrol fighters were at sea level, having just destroyed the torpedo bombers. The Japanese had no high-altitude fighter coverage. They had no early warning that dive bombers were overhead. Their first indication of attack came when American pilots pushed over into their dives. Norman Kleiss was flying as the second pilot in McCluskey's formation. When the air group commander gave the signal, Kleiss rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, aiming at Kaga. Through his telescopic sight, he could see the large red circle painted on the carrier's forward deck. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the fleet. Black bursts filled the sky. At 2,000 feet, Kleiss released his 500-pound bomb and his two wing-mounted 100-pound bombs. All three hit Kaga's forward flight deck near the Rising Sun insignia. Massive explosions erupted as ordnance and fuel ignited. Flames engulfed the forward section of the ship. Then came the escape. Kleiss pulled back on the stick, experiencing approximately 4 Gs of force during pullout. His vision narrowed. Blood drained from his head. He performed an anti-G straining maneuver, taking a deep breath, holding it, grunting to keep blood flowing to his brain. At 500 feet altitude, traveling at over 240 knots, Kleiss was now in the heart of the Japanese fleet. Every ship had guns. Every gun was firing. The standard procedure would have been to climb away at maximum power. Kleiss turned hard left instead. The maneuver was violent, sudden, unpredictable. Japanese gun crews tracking his aircraft adjusted their aim to where he should have been climbing. Shells detonated in empty air. Kleiss turned hard right, climbed, briefly, pushed the nose down, turned left again. No pattern, no predictability, pure chaos. His radio man gunner, John Snowden, crouched behind his .30 caliber machine gun, watching anti-aircraft bursts detonate behind and above them as Kleiss's random maneuvers threw off enemy gun-laying calculations. The technique worked. Despite flying through the center of the most heavily defended fleet in the Pacific, despite every Japanese ship firing at American aircraft, Kleiss escaped without significant damage. Behind him, Kaga burned. So did Akagi. So did Soryu. 3 Japanese carriers mortally wounded in approximately 5 minutes by Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The attacks caught Japanese defenders completely unprepared. Combat air patrol fighters were at the wrong altitude. Carriers were vulnerable. Timing was catastrophically perfect from the American perspective. But the bombs striking the carriers only achieved half the mission. The Dauntless crews still had to escape through intense anti-aircraft fire, low on fuel, deep in enemy-controlled airspace, with Japanese Zero fighters climbing to intercept them. What happened next would validate the jinking technique and save dozens of American lives. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Douglas SBD Dauntless pilots who survived the attacks on Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu now faced a problem that no training exercise had adequately prepared them for. They were scattered across the sky at various altitudes, flying individually or in small groups, surrounded by an enraged enemy fleet whose guns tracked them with murderous intent. Zero fighters were climbing rapidly from sea level, having finished destroying the torpedo bomber squadrons. Fuel gauges showed levels that made the return trip to Enterprise questionable at best. Lieutenant Junior Grade Franco Flaherty, flying from Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6, pulled out of his dive after hitting Kaga. His rear gunner, aviation machinist's mate Bruno Guido, immediately spotted 3 Zeros climbing toward them from below. O'Flaherty did not climb away as doctrine suggested. Instead, he stayed low, at approximately 500 feet, and began a series of radical turns that prevented the Zeros from establishing firing solutions. Turn left, hold for 3 seconds, snap right, push the nose down toward the waves, pull back up. Turn left again. Each maneuver threw off Japanese fighter pilots' aim by forcing them to constantly recalculate deflection angles. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, armed with heavier weapons, but they could not hit what they could not predict. Guido fired his single .30 caliber machine gun whenever a Zero crossed his sights. The defensive fire was not effective in destroying enemy fighters, but it forced them to maneuver, breaking their attack runs. For several minutes, O'Flaherty jinked violently across the ocean surface, while 3 Zeros pursued. Eventually, the Japanese pilots broke off, either low on fuel or called back to defend the burning carriers. O'Flaherty and Guido escaped. Their aircraft, riddled with bullet holes, landed on Enterprise nearly out of fuel. Post-flight inspection revealed over 30 bullet strikes, but nothing had hit critical systems. The random maneuvering had prevented concentrated fire from finding vital areas. Other pilots were not as fortunate. Ensign Tom Eversole, also from Scouting 6, followed standard procedure after his attack. He pulled up sharply, raised his dive brakes, and climbed away at full throttle in a straight line. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, tracking his predictable climb, placed a barrage directly in his path. Shells struck his engine. The Dauntless caught fire, rolled inverted, and plunged into the ocean. Neither Eversole nor his gunner survived. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Pilots who jinked during their escapes survived at significantly higher rates than pilots who followed standard climb-away procedures. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between life and death. At approximately 1300 hours on June 4th, Enterprise and Hornet launched a second strike against the remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu. The strike included Dauntlesses from both carriers, plus homeless aircraft from Yorktown, which had been damaged by Japanese counterattacks. These pilots had been briefed on the success of the morning strikes. They had also been briefed on the casualties. The message was clear: jink during your escape or die. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led Bombing Squadron 6 against Hiryu. Norman Kleiss flew in this strike as well, making his second attack of the day. At 17:03, 24 Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. Hiryu, having spent the afternoon launching strikes against American carriers, was caught in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sister ships that morning. Armed and fueled aircraft crowded her deck. Bombs rained down. At least 4 struck the carrier. Fires erupted immediately, fed by aviation fuel and munitions. Hiryu transformed into an inferno within minutes. The dive bomber pilots pulled out and immediately began violent evasive maneuvers. Kleiss turned hard left, then right, varying his altitude constantly. Anti-aircraft fire from Hiryu and her escorts filled the sky, but the shells consistently detonated behind or above the American aircraft. The gunners could not track targets that refused to fly predictably. Kleiss scored his second hit of the day, a 500-pound bomb near Hiryu's bow. He was the only pilot in the entire battle to score direct hits on 3 separate Japanese ships: Kaga in the morning strike, Hiryu in the afternoon strike, and later the heavy cruiser Mikuma on June 6th. His survival through 3 separate attacks against heavily defended targets demonstrated the effectiveness of unpredictable post-attack maneuvering. 18 of the 47 Dauntlesses that struck the Japanese carriers on the morning of June 4th never returned to their carriers. 2 more ditched near the fleet when they ran out of fuel. The losses were significant, representing approximately 40% of the attacking force. But the losses would have been catastrophically higher without jinking tactics. Japanese after-action reports from surviving anti-aircraft crews noted with frustration the difficulty of tracking American dive bombers during their escape phases. Gunners reported that American pilots maneuvered wildly and unpredictably, making accurate fire control impossible. Pre-war training had emphasized tracking aircraft following standard escape procedures. The Americans had stopped following standard procedures. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. The WWII, the most powerful naval striking force in the world, had been destroyed. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted fundamentally. Japan would never again possess the carrier strength to threaten American naval supremacy. The tactical lessons learned at Midway spread rapidly through the Navy's dive bomber community. Jinking was no longer an informal technique practiced by a few experienced pilots. It became standard doctrine taught to every Dauntless pilot in training. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, instructors modified dive bombing training syllabi. After students mastered basic dive technique, pushover, dive angle control, bomb release, pull-out, they learned escape procedures. The new doctrine emphasized violent, random maneuvering immediately after pull-out. No straight climbs, no predictable patterns, constant direction changes until clear of enemy defenses. Students practiced the technique during training flights. After simulated bomb runs, instructors would have students perform random maneuvers at low altitude. Turn left, roll right, vary altitude. The objective was to build muscle memory so that jinking became automatic rather than something requiring conscious thought during the stress of combat. The physical demands remained considerable, pulling 4 to 6 Gs during dive recovery, then immediately initiating additional high G maneuvers pushed human physiology to its limits. Some pilots grayed out or temporarily lost vision, the anti-G straining maneuver, taking deep breaths, holding them, grunting to maintain blood pressure, became essential technique taught alongside jinking. August 7th through 9th, 1942, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. American and Japanese carrier forces clashed again. Dauntless squadrons from Enterprise and Saratoga attacked the Japanese light carrier Ryujo. The pilots, now trained in jinking procedures, attacked and escaped with lower casualty rates than earlier engagements. Lieutenant Turner Caldwell led Scouting Squadron 5 from Saratoga in the attack on Rairujo. After bombing the carrier, Caldwell's pilots scattered across the sky, each aircraft jinking independently. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while intense, achieved few hits. Ryujo sank, but American losses were minimal. The contrast with earlier battles was notable. Better tactics meant higher survival rates. October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. This engagement produced one of the war's most remarkable Dauntless stories, though not directly related to jinking. Lieutenant Stanley Swedve Tasa, flying a Dauntless on combat air patrol, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, 2 Val dive bombers and 5 Kate torpedo bombers, while flying a nominally defensive aircraft. His aggressiveness and skill demonstrated that the Dauntless, despite being a dive bomber, could engage enemy aircraft effectively when necessary. But the battle also reinforced jinking doctrine. Lieutenant Stockton Strong, flying from Enterprise, attacked the carrier Zuiho. After releasing his bomb, Strong initiated violent evasive maneuvers as Japanese Zeros dove on him. He turned, rolled, and varied altitude constantly while his rear gunner, aviation radioman 3rd Class Ote Bates, engaged the Zeros with his .30 caliber machine gun. The combination of jinking and defensive fire kept the Zeros from establishing killing shots. Strong and Bates escaped. Through late 1942 and into 1943, Dauntless squadrons continued operating from both carriers and land bases throughout the Pacific. Marine squadrons flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal attacked Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Navy squadrons participated in strikes against targets across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Each mission reinforced the importance of unpredictable maneuvering. Pilots who jinked survived. Pilots who followed pre-war doctrine straight climbs away from targets died at higher rates. The statistics were clear and undeniable. Japanese defensive doctrine also evolved. Anti-aircraft crews learned to fire barrage patterns rather than tracking individual aircraft. By filling volumes of airspace with shrapnel, they hoped to hit randomly maneuvering targets through probability rather than precision. This tactic achieved some success, but American casualty rates remained lower than they had been in early 1942. The Japanese also increased fighter coverage over their fleets. The lesson of Midway, where dive bombers attacked unopposed because fighters were at the wrong altitude, was not lost on Japanese commanders. Combat air patrols now maintained fighters at multiple altitudes, specifically to intercept high-altitude dive bombers. This created new challenges for American pilots. Escaping through anti-aircraft fire while jinking was difficult. Escaping through anti-aircraft fire while jinking and evading fighters was exponentially more dangerous. Some pilots did not survive, but jinking remained the best available tactic for maximizing survival probability. By mid-1943, the Douglas SBD Dauntless was being supplemented and eventually replaced by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, a larger, faster, more powerful dive bomber. The Helldiver could carry heavier bomb loads and had better performance characteristics. But many pilots preferred the Dauntless. It was more forgiving, had better low-speed handling, and was extraordinarily rugged. The jinking doctrine developed on the Dauntless transferred directly to the Helldiver. Pilots attacking in the new aircraft followed the same post-attack procedures. Violent, random maneuvering until clear of enemy defenses. The principle remained valid regardless of aircraft type. June 19th through 20th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the last major engagement for carrier-based Dauntlesses. American carriers launched strikes against Japanese forces in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation had been bled white by 2 years of attrition. American pilots, better trained and flying superior aircraft, destroyed Japanese air groups with minimal losses. 26 Dauntlesses participated in a long-range strike against retreating Japanese carriers. All 26 returned safely despite attacking at extreme range in deteriorating weather. The mission demonstrated how far dive bombing tactics had evolved since 1942. Pilots attacked with precision, escaped through competent jinking, and navigated back to their carriers in darkness. Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, the pilot who had scored 3 hits during the Battle of Midway, did not participate in the Philippine Sea operation. After Midway, he had been assigned as an instructor at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, and later at Naval Auxiliary Air Station Cecil Field, Florida. He spent the remainder of the war training new dive bomber pilots, passing on the techniques that had kept him alive through 3 attacks against heavily defended Japanese ships. His students learned dive bombing fundamentals, angle control, sight picture, bomb release timing. But they also learned the critical importance of unpredictable escape maneuvers. Kleiss would demonstrate jinking during training flights, rolling his Dauntless through violent turns at low altitude while students watched and learned. The technique he had helped pioneer at Midway became standard doctrine taught to every dive bomber pilot in the Navy. By 1945, the Pacific War had moved beyond the carrier versus carrier battles that characterized 1942 and 43. American forces were closing on the Japanese home islands. Strategic bombing by B-29 superfortresses replaced tactical carrier strikes as the primary means of attacking Japan. Dive bombers continued operating in support of amphibious invasions, but the era of massive carrier air battles had ended. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was retired from frontline service in mid-1944, replaced by the SB-2C Helldiver. But Marine squadrons continued flying Dauntlesses until the end of the war. The last combat missions flown by Dauntlesses occurred in August 1945, just before Japan's surrender. The aircraft's combat record was extraordinary. Dauntlesses sank more enemy shipping than any other Allied bomber in the Pacific. The official tally included 6 aircraft carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 15 transports or cargo ships, and countless smaller vessels. The carrier victories alone, Shoho at Coral Sea, 4 carriers at Midway, Hiryu at Midway again, Ryujo at Eastern Solomons, and contributions to sinking other carriers changed the course of the Pacific War. But statistics do not capture the human cost. Hundreds of Dauntless pilots and radioman gunners died in combat. They died in burning aircraft. They died in the ocean after being shot down. They died when damaged aircraft crashed, attempting to return to carriers. The casualty rates, particularly in early engagements, were devastating. The development of jinking tactics reduced those casualties significantly. While exact statistics are difficult to compile, post-war analysis of combat reports suggests that pilots who employed random evasive maneuvers during escape phases survived at rates 20 to 30% higher than pilots who followed pre-war straight-line climb-away doctrine. 20 to 30% might not sound dramatic, but in the context of combat, where tens of thousands of sorties were flown, that difference represented hundreds of pilots who survived instead of dying, hundreds of families who received their sons, husbands, and fathers back after the war instead of receiving telegrams expressing the Navy's regret. The tactical evolution from predictable to unpredictable escape maneuvers demonstrates a fundamental principle of aerial warfare. Doctrine based on peacetime assumptions often fails when confronted with combat reality. The pre-war doctrine climb away at maximum rate after attacking made theoretical sense. It minimized time over target. It followed logical principles of geometry and physics, but it failed to account for enemy adaptation. Japanese anti-aircraft crews learned to anticipate American escape procedures and position fire accordingly. Once the doctrine became predictable, it became lethal. The pilots who survived were the ones who recognized that predictability was the enemy. They adapted. They improvised. They developed new techniques not found in any manual. And eventually, those techniques became the new doctrine taught to every student at every flight school. Norman Kleiss survived the war. He served as an instructor through 1944, then attended Naval Postgraduate School. After the war, he worked in the Bureau of Aeronautics, becoming head of Structures Branch in 1949. He later served as the Navy's representative at Lockheed Corporation, supervising aircraft inspectors, engineers, and test pilots. He retired from the Navy and lived quietly in Virginia for decades. In 2007, at age 91, he published his memoir, Never Call Me a Hero, co-written with his daughter Laura Orr and Tim Orr. The book provided a detailed account of his experiences at Midway and throughout the war. Kleiss died on April 22, 2016. At age 100, he was the last surviving dive bomber pilot to have scored hits during the Battle of Midway. His death marked the end of an era. The men who had flown Dauntlesses into combat, who had pioneered the tactics that changed naval warfare, were gone. But their legacy remained. The principle they demonstrated that unpredictability disrupts enemy defenses more effectively than any amount of armor or speed continues to influence aerial tactics. Modern strike aircraft employ random maneuvering during ingress and egress from target areas. Electronic warfare systems create unpredictable jamming patterns. Stealth technology makes aircraft unpredictable to radar. The fundamental concept remains valid across technological generations. The story of jinking, of the chaotic post-attack maneuvering that confused Japanese gunners and saved American pilots, is not as dramatic as the story of the bombs that sank carriers. There are no iconic photographs of pilots jinking. The maneuver does not lend itself to visual representation or Hollywood dramatization. It was simply pilots throwing their aircraft around the sky in violent, random patterns, trying to stay alive long enough to get home. But that unglamorous, undramatic technique saved more lives than any single piece of technology or tactical innovation in the dive bomber war. It turned predictable targets into unpredictable ghosts that enemy gunners could not track. It bought pilots the few extra seconds they needed to escape the kill zone and survive. The morning of June 4, 1942, when Norman Kleiss rolled his Dauntless inverted, dove deeper toward the enemy fleet, then snapped into violent, random turns instead of climbing away predictably, he was improvising. He was trusting instinct over doctrine. He was choosing chaos over order. He was also pioneering a technique that would become standard doctrine and save hundreds of American lives over the next 3 years of war. The Japanese gun crews that morning, trained to track aircraft following predictable escape profiles, found themselves firing at empty air. Their shells detonated where American pilots should have been but weren't. Their carefully calculated fire solutions became worthless against targets that refused to behave predictably. In the end, the greatest tactical innovation at the Battle of Midway might not have been the coordinated timing of multiple squadrons attacking simultaneously. It might not have been the courage of torpedo bomber crews who pressed attacks despite impossible odds. It might have been something simpler and more fundamental. It might have been the recognition that in war, predictability kills and chaos saves. That doctrine must adapt to reality or be discarded. That survival often depends on doing the opposite of what the enemy expects. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, nicknamed slow but deadly, proved deadly not just because of the bombs it carried, but because of the pilots who flew it. Pilots who understood that getting the bomb on target was only half the mission. The other half was getting home alive. And getting home alive often meant doing something crazy, rolling inverted when instinct screamed to climb, diving deeper when logic demanded altitude, turning randomly when efficiency suggested straight lines. The gunners below tracked predictable targets. The pilots above refused to be predictable. That refusal, that embrace of controlled chaos, made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.